Hey, in this video, we're going to go through a bit of an in-depth learning about the Zuplo request pipeline. So what that means is we're going to look at how a request enters the gateway, how it can be modified by policies and other hooks as it goes through the request pipeline to a request handler, and then eventually moving through the outbound or the response pipeline before going back to the client. So it's going to be very hands-on. We're going to get into quite a bit of detail here. So let's go and create a new project and look at some of the basics. So this project, we'll just call it pipeline. And what we're going to start with is looking at the most common way people modify or play with the request pipeline in Zuplo, which is using inbound policies. So if we look here, we're going to create a route. And this route is just going to hit this endpoint called echo.zuplo.io. It's a pretty cool little API we created that actually echoes back whatever it sees. So I just hit this with a get from the browser. It echoed back some JSON that said, hey, this is what I saw here. These were the headers. So all my headers you can see here. If I modify this and add, some URL stuff, and then maybe a query string, it will echo that back to me too. So I can see the full URL. I can see the details of the query. So it just sends back whatever was sent to it. So it's quite a useful tool when debugging a gateway to plug echo in and take a look at what it received, because that's what it's going to send back to you. So let's just call this our pipeline test route. And we're just going to put it on /pipeline, which should be fun. Now, policies is where most of the magic happens. So here we have handlers. Handlers actually sort of decide what happens with the sort of final version of the request, sends that off, then gets the response before sending it through the response pipeline. So this section here identifies and matches incoming requests. So this is going to match any get that starts /pipeline. That's going to get fed into this request pipeline where we can add policies, go to that handler, which might be a URL forward like this, it might be a URL rewrite, it might be a function or calling Lambda, or you can, the function is you can write your own handlers just like you can write your own policies. And then it's going to come back out through this response pipeline before going to the client. There's something particularly unique about the request pipeline. Let's go and take a look at it. So we're going to add a custom policy here. So I'm going to add a new module, inbound policy. Let's call it foo, because we're just having some fun. And what we're going to do is we're just going to change the request in some way as it moves through the gateway. So let's say we're going to add some headers. So I'm going to say const nr equals new Zuplo request. And I can initiate this based on the original request by passing that in. And that kind of sets us up to copy that request. But then I'm going to override the headers with my own headers. So I'm going to say foo is true. And then instead of returning the original request in this function, I'm going to return the new request. So what that means is when we plug this policy in here, so the policy was called foo, I don't need any of the options. So I'm using my custom code policy. That's going to receive the original request, and it's going to change the headers to have just one header. There are some other headers that will get added automatically, like origin and so on, which are required. It's going to change the headers just to have a foo is true header. So let's go and test that right now. I'm going to save that. 5 to 10 seconds, that should be deployed. There we go. I'm going to test. And I get echoed back. Notice I got a very small set of headers. And that's because I have that policy in there that is setting foo to true. So I never sent a foo header in. Actually, let's just try it. If I send a header in banana equals yellow, then that's not going to get echoed back to me because I'm replacing the headers. I'm changing the request and replacing the headers. So I see my echo here. Just to show you that in action, I'm going to delete that policy for a second, save that, and let's see what happens if we didn't have that policy in place. I'm going to get a lot more headers now. There we go. Look at this. You can see banana yellow, bunch of other stuff that's coming in there. Some of these are required, so they're always going to be there. But notice the banana yellow is there, but if I put that policy back now and save my change, then it's gone. So The request pipeline, just like the response pipeline, has the ability to change the request and the response respectively. The request pipeline has an extra superpower though. It can actually either return a request, like this is doing, or, as you can see here, if you look at this, it can return a response. If it returns a response, that says to the gateway, hey, don't carry on, send this back to the client immediately without going through the outbound pipeline, and is commonly used for authentication. So let's go and change this to be the silliest authentication policy you've ever seen. So what we're going to say here, we're just going to return the original request now. But we're going to look for a secret header. And we're going to say const header equals request.headers.get secret header. Okay. And if that's not there, if header equals undefined, actually I think this returns null if it's not, right? Yeah, I think it returns null. So I'm going to just do a not check here. I'll be a little lazy. If not header, it's going to say return new response, no secret header. Status, let's do a 403. Forbidden. Otherwise, it returns the request. So let's go and save that. Policy's already in place. And the first time I call this, I'm going to call it without the secret header, and we get a 403 forbidden. It literally saying back, said you didn't send us the secret header. If we send the secret header, and it can be anything, then boom, it goes through. And notice that the secret header is getting passed, as is banana. So request policies have this capability to actually short circuit everything and just send a response immediately. That's used in most authentication policies. Now, there's a lot of ways of doing things with policies. So you can actually modify the response as well. So let's add an outbound policy. So come in here, add a new outbound policy. We'll call this bar as the opposite of foo. And what this is going to do is just simply add a header to the response. So let's say response.headers.set bar is true. And that needs to be a string, sorry. Let's go and plug that in here. Add a custom code policy. The module is called bar. We don't need any options. I'm going to give this a friendlier name so we can see it. Let's change the name of this. Check secret header. Save my changes. So what we expect to see now is that the headers on the response, not in the payload, the headers on the response should have a bar policy now. So let's take a look at that. So that worked. Oh, I got an error. Oh, yeah. So the headers, we need to create a new response object here. This is a good thing to show you. So I'm trying to change the original response. That is a locked object at this point. So what I'm actually going to do is create a new response. Const nr equals new response, and I'm going to take the body of the original response.body, and I can actually just pass in the response here. But now this will not be locked. So now I can modify the headers of that response. So I say nr.headers.set, and I return the new response and not the old one. So let's save that. And now, okay, notice it's not in these headers because that's part of the payload. But if we look in here, we see a header was sent back with the value true. So the response policy can change the response. The request policy can change the request and short circuit the flow and send back a response, particularly useful for rate limiting, authentication, anything where you kind of want to do some preventative measure to stop things getting to the back end. But there's actually a lot more going on in the pipeline here that you can do. There's several stages. So let's go through the event order of Zuplo. There's actually a thing called a request hook, which is at the runtime level. So you can hook in and intercept a request across all requests using zuplo.runtime.ts. I'll show you that in a second. Then we execute the inbound policies in order. So we're going to set that up in a minute. Then it goes to the handler. The handler does its magic. Then we run the response outbound policies, and they will run in order as specified here. And then there's two other hooks that start to engage based in the order that they were registered. The response sending hook is another hook opportunity that you have, and the response sending final hook. The thing that's interesting about response sending final is at that point, the response is immutable, but you know it's what we're going to send out of the gateway. So that's quite useful if you want to do analytics or create sort of an analytics policy. I'll sort of show you why that might be valuable in just a minute. So let's get rid of these policies here. And what we're going to do is actually test the order that all these things execute in so we can see the order of them running. So let's create a simple inbound policy called inbound. And what that's going to do is just log the policy name. So context.log.info. Let's say inbound :space, and then actually let's do it with string interpolation. It's nicer. $policy name. Okay, so that's just going to log that, and we'll take a look at the logs when we're doing it. And we can add multiple of these to see how that works. We don't need these options, so let's actually, I think it's kind of nicer not to have them. Beautiful and clean. Get rid of those comments. There we go. Those are our little inbound policy. We're going to do the same with an outbound policy called outbound. And let's clean that up too. We don't need that. We don't need that. We're never going to use it. And we don't need that code. And this is going to context.log.info. Outbound $policy name. Okay. Nice and easy. Okay. So that's going to show us a couple of things. But one of the cool things is wherever you see a context object like this, you can actually attach these hooks. So on the inbound policy, we're going to add a hook. So we're going to say, and I can put this before or after, it doesn't matter because it's going to run asynchronously, context.add response sending hook. Let's do that one first. That takes an async method that takes a request and a context and has to return a response in this case because the response is immutable. Actually, it is mutable. So sorry, response should go there first. And what we're going to do is return response because we're not going to do anything. We just want to do some logging. And then I'm going to say context.log.info inbound add response. Actually, we'll just call it inbound response sending. And we'll just add that policy name. Then we're going to add another hook, context.add response sending final hook. Now notice this doesn't need to return anything. That also takes response request and context. But it doesn't need to return anything because the response is immutable. So you just, the void works great here. So context.log.info inbound response sending final $policy name. Okay, so this code is going to run last. This code is going to run first. This code is going to run in the middle, if that makes sense. So it'll run the inbound policy and then the add response sending hook, and then the code inside the add response sending final hook. Particularly useful, this approach of having this in the inbound policy, but this code here is really useful for doing analytics or timing, etc. So let's go and do pretty much the same thing for the outbound policy. Actually, there's no point adding hooks to that. The other thing I want to show you is the Zuplo runtime TS function. So we come in here and we had a runtime extension. This is where you had plugins and lots of other cool things. And on runtime init, we can actually add those same hooks, except there's an extra hook here called add request hook. So that is also async. It takes a request. It works just like an inbound policy. Request and a context. And in here, we're going to do some logging as well, but that's going to need to return request. It's why it's not happy right now because we're not matching the signature. And I'm going to say context.log.info runtime request hook, and there is no policy name. runtime.add response sending hook. This should be pretty easy now. Async response needs to return a response. Request context context.log.info runtime response sending return response. We could mutate that response if we wanted to though, but we don't want to. Bear in mind this will run on every request, so if you're going to use a runtime hooks, use them wisely. Runtime.add response sending final hook async response request context context.log.info. This is a void method, so I don't need to return anything. Runtime response sending final. And this thing will automatically hook up. We sense the presence of runtime init in a file called Zuplo runtime.ts, and we are good to go. So let's just make sure everything's plugged in. So let's go and add some policies. So we're going to do custom code here. Inbound. I don't need the options. Well, let's just call this inbound 1, so we know what it's called. Click OK. And then let's add the same policy again, but with a different name. Custom code inbound. And we will call this instance inbound 2. Let's add outbound custom code. Outbound was the name of the module. Don't need the options. Outbound 1. Okay. Custom code again. Don't need these options. They'll just be ignored. And outbound 2. Okay. I think that's everything we need to sort of show you everything that can happen in the request pipeline. So let's take a look. Let's test that. Hit test. There's our response. And if we look at the logs now, we're going to see a lot of logs down here. And let's have a look. What have we got? So we've got the request received in here. We have the inbound policy executing for the first one, the second one. The request handler takes place. And then we see the outbound policies executing, outbound 1, outbound 2. These are in reverse order, as you would expect. And then finally, we see the response sending hook for the inbound policy running, the response sending for inbound 2 inbound policy running. We see the runtime response sending last, and then inbound response sending final, inbound 1, inbound response sending final, inbound 2, and then the runtime response sending final is the one in the runtime hook. So the runtime hooks run first and last, as you would expect. The response sending final happens after all of the possible mutations take place, and that allows you to see what the final response that's going out of the gateway is. It's why that signature is not mutable. And obviously the hooks from the inbound policies run just in the order that they're registered, actually. So that is your deep dive on the Zuplo request pipeline. I hope that's useful. I hope it's helpful. As you start to see some of the things we do with Firebase and Superbase, I think this is actually quite a useful tutorial, so I'm going to reference it from some exciting Firebase content we have coming up. Thank you.